Hi, my name is Patricia, but everybody calls me Tina. I'm here to share with you this 5-year journey, or maybe a little bit longer than that I had in my PhD. And most of it happened within the profile life, not only the second stage, but also in the first part of the profile project. So I have worked with a few of the companies that are there. And some others that in side projects that happen along, and sometimes it's hard to have a clear cut where the research begins and where it ends when it lasts for that long. So maybe some of you will recognize yourselves in that and remember some of our interactions and different interviews that we had along the way. So I'll be talking about the social dimension of sustainable product development. That was the title of my research. Maybe it's a little bit of an outlier in this profile project because it's a very specific area that not many have been working with, or it's complementing also the work on sustainable product development too. So maybe just to introduce a little bit, like what do products have to do with social sustainability? I would say that a lot, and sometimes it's easier to think about consumer products that we have on our day-to-day and relate to those. So when we think about clothing, for example, if you have a social sustainability mindset, some people might think of sweatshops, for example, and some tough working conditions in the supply chain of clothing and the brands that we love here in Sweden too. Or when we think about chocolate, guilty pleasure, guilty not only because it's packed with calories, but also because for some people, they might think about child labor in the cocoa industry. Or even our mobile phones that we carry every day, we can think about violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Some people can relate to that. But when we're talking about industrial products, sometimes that connection is not very clear. And sometimes it raises a lot of eyebrows when you come to an interview and you ask product developers, like, what do you think about social sustainability? You get some very interesting conversations going. So I would say that there's a lot to do with product development also in terms of industrial products. And this is a little bit what I will share today. Although many of these companies can easily escape the public eye because they're not so much in direct contact with direct consumers. So sometimes the pressures for thinking about these things is not so evident, which creates some interesting and sometimes challenging dynamics inside companies on how to deal with these issues. So I hope a hypothetical task that I usually ask my students here at BTH to go through that also helps them to start warming up and thinking and connecting these two topics is that I ask them to imagine that they have been hired by a company to develop the most socially sustainable product that they can imagine. And that usually gets them like thinking like, how do I even start? What is it that I need to do? But also to describe how would you go about it? Like that's the task that you need to perform. And they quickly realize that there are some problems with this task. First, like they ask like, well, what is social sustainability? How do we define it? Like, how do we make it relevant for this particular product? What are the things that we need to think about? The second challenge is that often there's a question like, can a product be socially sustainable? What does that mean for a product to be socially sustainable? If you talk to systems thinkers, they will think like, well, isn't it dependent on other things as well and other systems to also become sustainable? How can a product in isolation can actually have that quality? And the last challenge that many students also raise is like, are product development organizations equipped for this task? Like how does it go? Like when you go into organizations, do they also have that kind of knowledge? Do they also know what they're supposed to do? How do they engage with their value chains in order to do that? So how is it in practice? So if we look for answers in the literature, we find similar challenges and very few answers there, which is why I got even more motivated to do my research, right? But when you find that clear gap, then you feel compelled to fill. There are many issues with definitions. A lot of researchers completely avoid trying to define it, and other researchers just put everything in there. So anything that we can't put in ecological sustainability, we push it to social sustainability. It becomes a huge mess to work with. There's also quite a lot of tools out there to work with it, but most of them are very compliance-based, like for reporting, organizational reporting, performance reporting, but not so much to support the design and development of products. The ones they do, they focus a lot in analysis, and even there, probably the past 10 years, most of the work in social sustainability in connection to products has been in social life cycle assessment. There's still a great deal of dissensus in how to define and the technological support and so forth. And very rarely they focus on how to create support for early phase of design. So most of them, like once products are already out there in the market, then you can assess what is the impact, but how to then bring those things early into the design phase so that you don't make those mistakes or you can create improvements when you're still have very little information and you're just ideating. And lastly, that there is almost like no empirical evidence of what companies are actually doing in terms of integrating social sustainability. And especially how they are integrated into all the way into product development. So what I wanted to do in my research was to understand how social sustainability could be integrated in product development organizations, but also to explore how a more systematic and also strategic perspective could be included in order to support organizations and product development organizations to have a positive contribution towards society's transition towards sustainability. So because the field was so diffused and unexplored, the result of my PhD is almost like a smorgasbord, I say in Swedish. Like I picked a few things and I tasted different areas and I tried to create a coherent narrative at the end. So I did a lot of exploration in the existing tools in social sustainability analysis and some prototyping on how to improve some of these tools in order to fit better early product development. So we did some prototyping in there and also exploring the more design thinking perspective in product development in terms of design for social sustainability, how to support organizations to decide on the focus of their design activity with the intention of creating positive social sustainability impact. I also try to fill in this gap of creating rich narratives, empirical evidence of how product development organizations have currently been integrating social sustainability. And along the way, I also did a lot of work in trying to integrate all of these findings and the new prototypes and ways of working into education here at BTH. And it's been a very interesting learning loop in that sense as well. So I'm going to talk very briefly about this last part, the integration in product development organizations, also because it's an area that I personally would like to continue exploring more. And that I also feel that it's the basis for creating organizations that have the right capabilities to further develop in other parts of integrating social sustainability as well. So one of the things that I found was that several categories started emerging by looking at different organizations and how they worked with social sustainability. And here I talk about integration in product development organizations, but it's some form of disintegration as well, because there was a range of ways of working and sometimes not working with social sustainability. So in terms of how these different organizations could see their interdependencies with other social systems, That was one of the differences. Also, to the extent that life cycle thinking was also brought into when thinking about social impacts. It was not often present in organizations that social life cycle thinking was an obvious thing also for social impacts. Also in terms of value chain engagement, organizations worked with their value chains to different extents. Some organizations focused more on first-tier suppliers, and other organizations also because they could see more value in the interdependencies with other social systems, they also went further into engaging their value chains in their activities. Which related to also the level of awareness and how they actually define social sustainability. What is it that they included in the scope of social sustainability? Connected to that, it was also the motivated factors. And I talked in the beginning in terms of like social pressures and the public eye. For some organizations, there was more pressure and was more obvious risks related, for example, with the supply chains was something that was more like knocking on their door. So they created also a different awareness of the risks and social risks and how to manage those. But for some organizations, this was something not really on the radar, which created also impacts in these other categories. In terms of product development focus, for some organizations, this was more like a corporate responsibility piece of work. But for other organizations, it was more related to also product development, and it was beginning to be more systematically integrated in some of the concerns. And some differences was also in terms of the locus of work, like whose responsibility in the organization social sustainability work actually relies. There were differences in there too. And the role of top management in making things happen. Some organizations took a more bottom-up approach in bringing things from the product development perspective, but for other organizations, this was like a top management decision to be made, and that trickled down through different areas of the organization. So there was also differences in there. And by looking at these differences, I created what I call the typology of approaches to social sustainability in product development organizations, and three types of approaches that were derived, what I call the insular, the connected, and the systemic types of approaches. And these differences here together led to the formulation of this typology, and which meant that the organizations that showed a better understanding of the interdependencies and the complexities with other social systems also developed a way of organizing their activities and integrating the work in a way that also enhanced the collaboration between different parts and different areas of product development, and also different areas of the organization, not only within product development. Also, that more systemic perspective of social sustainability decided also on the scope and the definition of social sustainability and what social challenges are and can be for the organization in order that they become more encompassing and aligned with the definition. So some conclusions, because I think I'm running over time. I'll put them all there. Is that it seems that defining social sustainability is critical for organizations to also develop ambitious visions that can also help them to align strategic work better. And also to allow these interdependencies to be identified and the integration of life cycle thinking to go beyond the scope of organizations and moving on to a more value chain perspective, where a range of impacts with these other systems can be identified and managed, that they become part of the radar of the organizations. Also that there's a need to balance stakeholder expectations, but with also science-based social sustainability goals. There's a lot of conversation about ecological science-based goals, but bringing the social sustainability perspective more also into science-based goals can also support that work and not wait for the risks to become too high, so to be more proactive. And also showed that organizations that were more along the lines of the systemic type could actually see that there's a self-benefit in working with social sustainability in a more encompassing way, and also expanded their notion of what responsibility and where the responsibility for social impacts lie. It also showed that there's a need to balance incremental work where we do a little bit less bad, but also with systemic change. These two things should happen simultaneously. It's not one or the other. Only systemic work can be quite challenging in long-term perspective, but incremental work is also beneficial for organizations and systems that they rely on. But at the same time, that organizations need support in order to balance this ambition. Even if they set highly ambitious goals in terms of doing social sustainability work, they need support in how to balance with this pace of progress. And that organization design processes and routines should be compatible with the challenge. The organizations that I looked at already have very well-defined ways of working with ecological sustainability, for example, and that social sustainability could in some form like piggyback on those structures that already exist if there is an increased awareness of how ecological and social sustainability actually relates and how they are interdependent in order to achieve sustainability goals. So a bit of a future research where I'm heading towards. I want to focus more on this typology application and also how to support organizations to see a path and a roadmap in order to navigate this typology from an insular perspective into a more systemic perspective. And in that sense, investigate and develop practices that can support product development organizations to mature in that kind of work. And also for different types of product development organizations to start identifying what are the organizational leverage points to intervene in order to bring social sustainability work into the picture. Thank you very much. And if anyone wants to learn more, I'm happy to share the link to my dissertation or give you a copy if that helps.